to a point where I want to actually use several different, fairly divergent algorithms. And basically, I'm more a fan of ensemble learning now.
You're more a fan of what?
Ensemble learning.
Okay.
So where we don't just use something like neural nets. So neural nets are interesting, and they have certain applications where they're really good. So like the convolutional neural nets have been used for like the different picture munging, like Microsoft and Google and whatnot have put out various picture mungers where you give them like Starry Night and you give them a picture of the Seattle skyline and they turn the Seattle skyline into a Starry Night style, right, as if Picasso did. And that's cool, but it brings up the biggest weakness of neural nets, which is they're hard to understand.
Yes.
Right? It's very difficult to determine why the network did something, made a decision. And as a counterexample to their goodness, right, Google got slammed a few years ago because it misidentified black people as gorillas. Right? It was really like a PR disaster. They yanked the picture recognition right away. And then they learned, oh crap, we just took pictures around the office and we didn't have any black people. Oops.
That's a different kind of PR disaster.
It was a double PR disaster. Yes. Yes. That particular demographic is close to unrepresented. Now, it's better represented today than it was then, but that was both a machine learning disaster and simply a reflection of the company demographics. So, and nobody knew it, right? It had gone through months and months of testing, right? But it all had to do with garbage in, garbage out. And that's the big danger with neural networks. So unless you absolutely know what you're feeding in, and you are 100% behind it, you can't know what you're getting out. And Google has some fairly smart neural net people.
Yeah.
And a fair amount of hardware to throw at the problem. A lot more than my 16-core water-cooled machine. So that's why I'm like, I also prefer learning methods where I can actually observe why a decision's being made. And if I can get multiple confirming signals, a neural net's great if it confirms a signal from something I understand. Then I'm much happier. Did we get everybody back? It looks like we're still missing a couple. I think we'll go on anyway. Okay. So, bias. So this is pretty much straight out of Wikipedia. So your statistics, it's systemic distortion of a stat. So obviously there are various malicious ways that could happen. We're not concerned with those, but there's a lot of unintentional ways that can happen. Right? So if I always observe the stock price on a Monday, right? So if I get weekly observations, they're always on the same day. Well, I've got bias. It may not hurt me, but I have bias. Right? I think Caesar, you said you have a whole series of trades you always do on Fridays. Is that right? In one of your presentations?
I don't remember. I'm not currently trading anything. I'm only trading on Fridays.
Ah, okay. Somebody in one of our presentations had said that. And it, as long as it's not hurting you, that's fine. But there is a bias there, and you have to be aware of it. Another way you can have bias is if you only observe, say, large cap stocks, or only small cap, or only international, or only US. Right? There's all kinds of bias that we probably all do, even though we're not realizing it. Right? Who here actually, in their regular trading, analyzes non-US stocks? Like 4 people. Right? So all the rest of us have bias in our observations. So the question is it going to hurt us? Then you have a bias sample. So a sample falsely taken to be typical of the population. And then what actually tends to hurt us the most in machine learning, estimator bias. So we construct an estimator right, whose values differ from the reality. So what does that look like graphically? So to the question earlier, of isn't this stuff all about clustering? Well, yes, it is. So if I have this little dot here, which I don't know how well it is visible to the whole room. Is this the laser pointer? So there's a little dot right there. And we're going to say that that's the ideal solution. So that's actually what represents the stock price of whatever we're interested in from now into the future. So that is the absolute best mathematical representation of what will happen. I can have B1, which is this big orange circle, right? So it has all kinds of wild variance. So for various points, it's wildly wrong. But as you can see, the distance on both sides is about equal. Right? In every dimension, it is about equidistant. Right? So it has very little bias. It's just wildly wrong. Or I can have this blue one, which is highly biased. Its center is way over here, right, in a small circle. So it's highly biased, but has a much lower variance, right, because the area of the circle is much smaller. This turns out to be, this will be an important trade-off, and there is no concrete answer as to which you want. Overall, I tend to favor lower variance, higher bias because you can offset your bias, right? If I can in some way determine, say through dry run for a few weeks, that my bias is here. So the thing with lower variance can be corrected. The thing with high variance cannot. So overall, I tend to favor bias over variance, as do several of the other learning folks. I do not claim that that is the one be-all answer at all.
So are there other people that do favor the high variance over the bias then, I guess?
Not in the readings I've seen, but I assume that my selection of readings is biased. Right, I have a certain mentality, and so I'm attracted to certain works.
Right. No,
So.
fair.
For all I know, maybe the right answer is you do want low variance and higher bias. You know, in the variance bias trade-off, you want to favor bias. It works for me.
I just didn't know if there was like two active pools of thought and you just tended to go for one and then the other one would just real
Probably, and I'm probably blind to the other one.
Okay.
That's my guess. My personal opinion tends to be that if there is a school of thought, there are probably people in it. Maybe that's just the pessimist in me. So, actually, this was pretty much lifted straight from Wikipedia, from right there. Ridge regression is an example of a technique that specifically lets in a little bias, but reduces the variance. And even in their generic description says, and increases the reliable estimation overall. So most of the readings I have found tend to be phrased that way. There are probably scenarios where you do want higher variance and lower bias. Okay, correlation. So correlation, when you normally see it, which will be in pretty much, I think, any of the stock contexts. They usually mean this one. So Pearson's product moment coefficient, which is also known as Pearson's correlation coefficient, or simply the correlation coefficient. This is not the only way to determine correlation. It is a relatively cheap computational way to calculate correlation. Right? Correlation can easily become super quadratic. So it's important that we have computational efficiency. For those who are not computer scientists, super quadratic means that as you get even moderately sized, you start taking inordinate amounts of time. And as you become large, you start approaching infinite amounts of computer resources to perform the calculation. Quadratic is generally considered bad, but most of the machine learning stuff is somewhere in the quadratic range. Some of it is slightly super quadratic. Okay, so this is the most familiar measure of dependence between two quantities. It's only defined if we have standard deviations and they're finite and non-zero. Theoretically, we'll get a +1 if we have perfect correlation. So if the S&P 500 perfectly corresponds to the price of Apple, the largest stock in it, then the correlation between those two is going to be 1. Now, we know that that correlation is going to be high because Apple is a huge percentage of the S&P 500. So is Google, so is Amazon, right? We've got 5 or 10 stocks that are 50% of the S&P 500. So they're all going to have high correlation to the overall index. But in theory, we could have +1. -1 would be perfect decreasing. So they're perfectly uncorrelated, right? So as my price goes up, that thing goes down. So Corey likes to trade the VIX, and when he talks about the VIX being a fear indicator, and it tends to have an inverse correlation to the S&P 500. It does tend to. It's not a -1, but it is negative. Right? So that means that they are inversely correlated.
It's not -0.8 or something.
It's what?
Isn't it
Negative 0.8, okay. Which is highly inverse. And then we have things that are actually 0. So 0 indicates things that are perfectly independent, which is essentially nothing in the public market.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And worse, in what we trade, right, during downturns, correlation moves up. So correlation moves closer to 1, basically the entire spectrum shifts, right, during downturns. Okay, and then
Say that again.
correlation during market downturns tends to move up. So the entire spectrum, so if you have something that's normally at a 0.2, like let's say bonds and the S&P 500, maybe we'll just say that it's normally a 0.2. During a downturn, they're both likely to move down in sync because basically panic sets in, everybody starts pulling all their money out of the market, and so bonds probably move up to a 0.3 or a 0.4. The S&P is going down, bonds start going down some. It's muted, it's still better. But it doesn't achieve, especially in the recent market with quantitative easing, right? With quantitative easing, we've started seeing correlations all moving together, right? So bonds are much more highly correlated to equities today than they were, say, 20 years ago. And if you go to Japan, basically everything is extremely correlated, right? Where the government is just buying the whole market. And they just have auto algorithms that just buy every day or buy every week. And they just buy a bucket of everything. We're getting a little more of that due to mutual fund investing, right? So mutual funds and closed-end funds, and basically people just like auto investing at their paycheck. So. But hey, that creates opportunity. Mm-hmm.
So in downturn, you said correlation it increases.
Yes.
So is that your study or is it?
Actually, the first one that I saw say that I think was Bernstein.
Okay.
I think it was. Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, the market hits a downturn, everything takes a downturn.
Yeah. But the whole point, right? So the whole point, right, why a CFA will tell you to invest in stocks and bonds and make sure you're diversified is to protect you from that, because they're supposed to move independently. And in good markets, they do tend to move independently. They're not completely independently, right? They have a correlation above 0, but it's not high above 0. During a down market, it moves significantly up. Okay, so for things that are not perfect in either perfect correlation, decreasing, or perfect linear increasing relationship, perfect linear decreasing, or perfect independence, we have some value in the open interval, negative +1. Big thing about Pearson's correlation, it doesn't detect nonlinear relationships. There are other algorithms that do. Yes?
So, in terms of trading, right, so if you're hedging a portfolio, I can see how correlation makes sense. If it's trading, especially doing intraday trading, the only way I can see using correlation is maybe doing an arbitrage between securities that should have moved, which haven't moved.
So you can do stuff like that, but you can also look for autocorrelations, which are correlations of the instrument to itself. So you can see sometimes patterns, like intraday patterns, like the 12 o'clock hour to yesterday's 12 o'clock hour. Or you can see them over time. Or you can look at
performance based on pairs.
yeah, and then I was going to get into pairs. So you get into like the S&P versus the FTSE,
Sure.
stuff like that. So there are more correlation relationships that are interesting. And what you can do, right? So to your question earlier about, well, why don't I just like toss data out of neural net? You have to make sure to give the right data in.
Right.
So if I give these kinds of data in, then it can determine. But if I just give it the prices, I haven't done enough feature engineering for the for most neural nets. I won't say all. There are certain neural nets that could, but most neural nets are going to be completely unable to detect, to construct a correlation between these divergent instruments.
But even in the examples you gave, what you're really looking for is things that is not close to the mean as it should be, right? So what you're trying to do is you're trying to predict that it should move back to the mean.
No, correlation is not always related to the mean.
So let's, for example, in the example you gave for the time, right? So let's say 12 o'clock, S&P 500 is down by 2% when it's usually down by 1.5%.
Mhm.
So in this case, you think I have an edge of 0.5%.
Maybe.
So that could be a
Or it could mean that there's a trend. It could signal a breakout. It could signal any number of things, right? And all of that what you're constructing is a hypothesis, and you might be right. But you have to remember that that's just a hypothesis, and it then needs to be tested. And what we're concerned about in machine learning is, and we'll get into this in the demo, we as human learners tend to look at 1, 5, 100 hypotheses. We want our machine learning algorithms to look at hundreds of millions or trillions of hypotheses. We want to give them the flexibility to construct many hypotheses, and then just let the computer figure out the ones that work. Now, we might want to put filters on that, right, to only allow it to construct sensible hypotheses, where sensible is some measure of what I'm comfortable with. And that's what we'll get into in hypothesis space. Okay, so last slide before the break. So I was a little worried that the presentation would go longer than I originally anticipated. We're probably only going to get parts 1 and 2 tonight, I'm guessing. So rank correlation. So it's represented by more formula than just Pearson's for population correlation. Population correlation basically has a de facto standard. Rank correlation does not. This is a measure of how one variable increases, another variable tends to increase, but it doesn't require a linear relationship. And a common mistake is to regard, because they say correlation, population correlation and rank correlation as interchangeable. They're not. And as an example, right, these all have rank correlation according to 2 different algorithms of 1. So they have perfect increasing rank correlation. Right, but their linear correlation is 0.75. Right, so these pairs 0, 1, 10, 100, 101, 500 to 102, 2000. Right, so they absolutely move up in lockstep by rank, but the magnitude matters. So rank correlation is interesting. It tends to not be what we're going to use for machine learning, and I just kind of wanted to put this here to make sure that you don't get tripped up. You're welcome to use something other than Pearson's correlation, but you should use something that is some flavor of linear correlation.
So is that really the most common thing? Like
Pearson's, yeah. Or we just use raw variance.
Wouldn't non-linear coefficients or correlations be more accurate than?
They can be. So depending on the perversity of your data set. And I do have some interest in using other nonlinear correlations. But so far I haven't deviated from the standard ML literature, which says use use linear correlation. Once I'm comfortable enough and I've got good results, you know, what I expect to see if I just swap out my correlation is just a slight improvement, right? Because what definitely from the white papers on other forms of correlation, the improvements are minor, except for the perverse data sets, which really don't happen in something like stock, right? There is no actor out there who is specifically constructing a stock price to be in a flower shape, right? Because they like, you tend to have like, you know, parametric equations that look like, you know, looping, you know, concentric loops. And I've never seen a stock diagram look like that, right? I've never seen any subset of stock prices be that perverse. You know, they tend to just be, all, you know, they're all waveforms, and they have some, you know, if you map them all together, it appears a little noisy, and then you can use math to map that out. Linear is close enough, and if you want to use some other kind of thing, you'll get a minor improvement.
Do you know if this holds true across all instruments, or is this mainly just looking at variant depending on the instrument you're trading?
So I don't know that it holds true across all instruments. I assume that it does because the primary determinant of all instruments is time.
Right.
So they all have an absolute common coordinate.
Makes sense.
How much work has been done transferring things from time domain to frequency domain to try and get straight lines? Laplace transforms. I know.
I don't know.
Fourier.
Yeah.
Because that's what Fourier is lead to. Actually.
Absolutely. So I definitely use very basic waveforms, but they're very basic. Basically like percent differences. And it's essentially just a form of regularization of the data. It's nothing really, you know, there's no waveform magic to it. In fact, I've got some demo slides out of my programs. Pretty soon, I can't remember how soon. But yeah, so all of these things are interesting. And these are all going to be fodder for the forum that I'm going to talk about later in the presentation. So hopefully I can get everybody interested in all this stuff, and we can actually have some lively discussions and actually, you know, have forum posts and be able to go off on these tangents a bit longer and deeper. So that's one thing that I'm really hoping to get out of the group. Okay, that's the end of part 1. So sorry to keep you guys so long. 10-minute break, then we'll do part 2.
Yeah, 10 minutes?
Yeah.
10 minutes.
Question for you.
Yes.
Deposit.
Can it correlate with that?